It's a great honor to be a part of the activities that you are doing this week for Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month, or as they say, every day is Earth Day. And I've been asked to talk about the importance of environmental storytelling, but I've been warned that in Italy, sometimes the word storytelling means something a little different from the way I use it. I'll be with you for quite a while this morning. It's morning here. So let me give a brief overview of what I'm going to do. I'll talk about what storytelling means to me and to the international community I work with. I'll talk about the environmental aspects of it. And then I'll give examples and illustrate the different ways that storytelling, different kinds of stories are used to speak to different audiences, depending on the level of their involvement. As was said in the introduction, I grew up in a storytelling family, so I'm accustomed to hearing stories used to review what has happened, to share an entertainment, and to explain things. And what I want to say about the meaning of storytelling is anthropologists tell us humans have been on this earth for at least 200,000 years as Homo sapiens. And we've only had literacy common in the last 100, 200 years. So that means that although the priesthood and the nobles could write down histories in a format that they could read, everyone else, and before those times, for tens of thousands of years, history had to be conveyed orally. The wisdom that people had collected had to be conveyed orally. It was recorded from mouth to ear, recorded in the memories of the people who listened. So orality has been with us long, long before literacy. And it almost seems as though the human brain has developed in order to absorb information through stories. It's as though there's a story-shaped slot in our memory. And if information comes to us in story form, even if we can read and write, if information is in story form, it fits and it sticks and we can remember it. And even negative stories, even foolish stories, such as the catastrophe scenarios and the false narratives, those will stick. It's hard to get them loose. Stories are powerful. Humans seem to be designed to listen and pay attention to stories. Lawyers know that. In a jury trial, if they can arrange the facts into a story that favors their client, it's likely that the jury will vote in their defense. So, stories have power, but what do I mean by environmental stories? Well, as you perhaps have been hearing this week, our environment is in trouble. Climate change brings heat waves and droughts and problems with destroying agricultural land so that people have to find somewhere else to live. And that means waves of migration into Europe, into North America, people who are losing their living because of climate change. There are issues of too much rain in the wrong place, floods and mudslides. There are issues with wildfires and diseases spreading because of the vector strap. It's terrible out there. You listen to that, and you may want to just turn off the radio and the television and the computer and your phone and get a bottle of wine and go sit somewhere in the dark. This is it's a difficult time, and you young people going to grow up into it, you've got a heavy burden to share. How can stories help with this? Well, You care because your life and your children, if you will have any, will depend on a livable world to live in. But think about why we care about this. I sometimes tell about when I was a small child. My mother says that it could take over an hour to walk around one block with me because I wanted to stop and look at every leaf and stone and bug. Well, if you've been around small children, you know they often are like that. They are fascinated by the wonder of the world that they have come into, that they're learning about. It is a privilege to be with a small child and be reminded of that wonder. Some of us grow up and don't lose that sense of wonder. And they say that those adults who still have that feeling become poets, musicians, artists, and scientists. Because scientists study the world because we love it, because we're fascinated by it, just like a small child. And sometimes it can be hard to get us out of playing in the dirt because that's what we love to do. Think about your own connection with the environment. Can you remember a time when you were stunned, fascinated, looking at the way the leaves grow up and know just how to grow, looking at ants crawling and they know how to build, looking at a sunset? Was it in a city park? Were you hiking in the mountains? Think about that. That is your connection to nature. Yes, the air you breathe, the food you eat, the water you drink, but your heart connection is your impression of the beauty and the wonder of this world. Science communicators call that anecdote your origin story. And they advise that when a scientist is going to talk to an audience of people who may not have the same background, it's important to make a connection to the audience. And one way to do that is to tell an origin story. For me, the anecdote about being a small child and being fascinated at everything the way I still am, that is my origin story. What would your origin story be? Hiking in the mountains, seeing the last of a glacier? Perhaps being in a park and watching how the flowers open in the daylight and close it. What would you think about that? That's a very important reference point for you. And it is a story, even if it doesn't have the beginning, middle, and characters, setting, la, 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 that literature teachers talk about. That's a very important point for you. We don't take action to defend something unless we care about it, unless we love it. And we can't love it unless we understand it, unless we know about it, unless you know about species going extinct, unless you know about the effect of cattle on and agriculture on the environment. You have no reason to change your diet. Unless you know about the fossil fuel industry, unless you know, you have no reason to change the way you use energy, for instance. I talk about this action depending on care, depending on knowledge. I talk about that. In English, it would be aware, care, dare. You have to be aware in order to be able to care, but it has to touch your heart to make you care, to motivate you to take action. And so I'm going to be talking with you today about the role of stories in helping people be aware and care and even dare. Now, there are many different kinds of stories, and I choose the kinds of stories I tell depending on my listeners. There's the story, the storyteller, and the listener. And of those three, I think the one who deserves the most attention is the listener, because what are they likely to be interested in? What is their level of knowledge already? Where will I fit my story into their world? Our ancestors told lots of stories about animals and plants, stories that pretended to explain why they are the way they are. Now, our ancestors lived very close to nature. They knew that tigers and raccoons are born with their stripes. They knew that rabbits are born without tails. When they made up a fanciful story that pretended to explain how this happened, it was often a story that really had a lesson about human behavior. But these stories do also include information about the animals and plants, and we can use stories like this to share that information with people who may not know about it so much. For instance, can you identify the trees that grow on campus? Do you know which one is an oak and which one is a pine and which one is a maple? Well, let me tell you, now this actually is a true story that happened to me. When we first moved into our house, we had two big mimosa trees in the front yard. They were beautiful, broad spreading trees with lovely pink fragrant flowers early in summer, and they shaded the west side of the house from the hot sun. It does get hot in Oklahoma, sometimes 35 to 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. We appreciated the shade. So it was a terrible thing when we had an early freeze one fall that killed those trees. We waited the next spring to see if they would revive, but they didn't. So we took them out and we decided, okay, now we need trees in the yard, but it should be a native kind of tree. Mimosas are not native. No wonder they froze. We need something strong. So we selected red oak trees. We bought the biggest ones we could afford. The trunk was maybe about this big. And we planted them, and they grew the next year, but they weren't big enough to shade the house yet. I thought, what were we thinking? Oak trees grow slowly. How long will it be before we have any shade from these oak trees? So one day when I was walking in the neighborhood, I saw a yard with a good size tree that was a good size to put shade. It was the same kind of red oak. And since I saw the neighbor in the yard, I said, "Excuse me, sir, how old is your oak tree? I'd like to know how long it takes to get so big." And he said, "That's not an oak tree. That's a maple tree." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, when I bought it, they told me it was a maple." I said, "But maples have a leaf like this, kind of star-shaped leaf. And your tree has a leaf like that. That's an oak leaf." And he looked at it and he said, "Well, my golly, I guess that explains all those acorns." He had had his tree for years with acorns on the ground, and he still thought it was a maple tree. Sometimes what people think prevents them from seeing what's right there in front of them. What do you know about the trees? Could you recognize a maple from an oak, from a pine tree, from all the different kinds? I tell this story sometimes to the Native Plant Society here in our state, and they appreciate that some people just don't pay attention. They just aren't aware. There are probably birds on your campus. Do you know their names? Do you know how to tell them apart? For just basic awareness, there are stories that our ancestors told about telling the birds apart. There's a story I learned from a Japanese colleague, but I have reset it for the birds that live in my part of the world, and you could probably change it to fit the birds in Italy. The story says, long ago, all the birds had white feathers. All kinds of birds had white feathers. And the feathers were very pretty, but they were also dangerous because the birds were so easy to see, whether they were in the trees or on the ground. A hungry fox could see them on the ground. A hungry raptor or weasel in the tree could see them. Also, everyone having the same feathers was a problem during mating season. How could they tell which kind was which and find a mate of the right kind? Yes, some had a crest and some had long, long tails, but you didn't see that from a distance. White feathers were a problem. What could they do about it? And the story, because it's a fanciful fictional story, it said they went to Owl, because Owl had a paint store. And they said, Owl, please help us. We need to be painted in different colors so that each kind of bird has a different appearance and we can tell each other apart from a distance. And Owl said, this is my business. I sell paint for money, but you are all fellow birds, so I will give you 1 week. Come to my shop and I will paint you any colors you like for free. But after that, I charge. So the birds had 1 week to come to Owl. And you can talk with your audience. Some came, they wanted to be pink and they were flamingos. And the bluebirds wanted blue on the back and red in the front. And the American eagle was white head and a brown body. They all came, and I have picture cards to show the different kinds. If I'm with an audience that may not yet know the different birds that they have in their area. So they came and they got painted, and Crow watched. Cardinal, bright red, no, that's not. Blue, maybe yellow, pink. Crow couldn't decide, and it came to the last minute. And Crow ran into Owl's paint store. Owl said, I'm going to close soon. Oh, no, you've got to paint me now. I want pink. And Owl started to paint, but no, not pink, not yellow and brown, like meadowlark. Oh, no, that's not right. Let's try red. No. And Crow kept changing his mind. And finally, in rushing around, knocked over a big pot of black paint. And when the time was up, there was Crow covered with black. Just black. I could have had those other colors. Owl, it's all your fault. And ever since then, you may see an owl, and it happens here, and in Japan, I don't know about Italy. If an owl is trying to sleep in a tree, sometimes the crows will come and bomb and chase after the owl. We could have had colors. And the story pretends to explain that that's why the crows go after the owl. Well, anyone who knows birds knows that they didn't get their colors from paint. The story is about human nature, about making up your mind at the last minute and then blaming someone else for the mistake you might have made. But if you are working with an audience that doesn't know the different kinds of birds and their colors, if you tell a story like that and show pictures of this one is meadowlark and this one is robin and this one is blue jay or whatever black and white magpie do you have in Italy, then the story helps. It fits into the story-shaped slot in the brain, and people can remember. Science? Well, it's not a scientific explanation of how they got their colors, but it can lead to a discussion of the role of the colors. Yes, the male cardinal has bright red feathers, but the female is dull brown. She sits on the nest, and that protects her. You can use the story to introduce a lesson or a teaching, a discussion about the actual science. There are stories from all over the world about why does bear have a short tail? Why does rabbit have a short tail and big ears? These are all fiction, fanciful stories, but they make you remember when you see the animal, see the short tail. You could remember the story, and our ancestors used it to remember the science was psychology, remember about human behavior, about greed or postponing decisions or something like that. And at least it fixes in your mind, and you can research the story to be sure that what you say about the behavior of the animals is at least accurate. The Greek myths and Roman myths had many stories about flowers. For instance, that there was a girl who fell in love with the sun god and used to sit outside and watch him cross the sky. Every day, she forgot to eat and drink. She just watched the sun god until she withered away and was going to die. And the gods took pity on her and turned her into a sunflower. And the sunflower follows the path of the sun. Now, plant physiologists have done a lot of work about light-affected growth hormones and how it makes the flower turn and wonder why and what is the function. But the story of the girl who was so besotted with the sun sticks the image of the sunflower in your mind so that then you can hang. It makes a hook, and you can, maybe a hook shows, yes. Makes a hook, and you can hang the story, you can hang the science lesson on the fanciful fictional story. So I think there are many roles for fictional stories as long as you research the science. I worked for many years with a digital, a virtual newsletter for science educators, for environmental educators. And they wanted me to write a column where I would pair a traditional story, or sometimes I wrote original ones for them, with some science information that was relevant to the time and place. These were my EarthTeller columns, and they're now reproduced on my website where people are welcome to use them. Here's an example. People don't always know or don't always appreciate the fact that vultures play an important role in cleaning up our world. They eat dead things. There is a story from the Cajun people in Louisiana, America, about a vulture who was sitting on a fence and looking very, very sad and thin. Nothing had died for many days, so the vulture had not eaten anything. Along came a hawk who lighted on the fence and said, "My friend, why do you look so bad?" Vulture said, "I'm waiting for something to die. There has been no dead animal, and I've had nothing to eat. And Hawk said, why do you eat dead stuff? That's disgusting. And Vulture said, that's my job. My job is cleaning up dead stuff. Papa God, he gave me that job. And Hawk said, that's awful, but God helps those who help themselves. Why don't you go out hunting? There is so much fresh meat that you could get. Like, look at that rabbit over there across the field by that fence. I'll show you. I'll show you how you can get fresh meat. And so Hawk proudly flew up high and circled and then came down toward the rabbit. And the rabbit, with its eyes on the side of its head where it could see danger coming, the rabbit saw the hawk coming. At the last second, the rabbit jumped away and the hawk hit the fence post and died. And the vulture said, yep, I knew if I waited, Papa God would give me something. So that's the story about Hawk and Vulture. And I used it to introduce a situation that was happening in Nepal and northern India, where they depend on vultures. Vultures eat dead stuff. And the Parsi people do not bury dead bodies. They put the dead bodies up on a high scaffold. It's called sky burial. And they wait until the vultures have cleaned the bones. And then they bury the clean bones. Farmers depend on vultures too. If they have an ox or a horse or mule that becomes ill, well, they try to heal it as best they can with medicine and rest. But if the animal dies anyway, they have a problem. Those animals are so big, you would have to dig such a big grave to bury them safely. They should be buried because if they died of some disease that could be catching to other farm animals or even to people. But the diseases of people and mammals are often not diseases of birds. So they would leave their dead ox or donkey out in a back field, and the vultures would come and pick the bones clean, and they would not spread the disease. Well, that was a good idea, except in Nepal and North India, they had a big problem because the vultures were disappearing. 90%, 95% of the vultures were gone. There were not enough vultures to eat the sky burial or to eat the dead ox and donkeys. And with all this dead meat lying around, foxes and rats came and they ate up the dead bodies, but they could carry the diseases. And it became not only uncomfortable and awkward, but dangerous to have so many dead carcasses lying around with not enough vultures. What happened to the vultures? Well, scientists tried to study them. They studied the usual suspects. Insecticide, perhaps. Had they gotten insecticide, insect to a larger animal, larger. Finally, the vulture ate those and got a lethal dose of insecticide? No, they did not find insecticide in the dead vultures. Maybe lead from animals that had been shot with shotgun pellets, and the vultures ate them and collected the lead, and it killed them. No. All they could learn from the dead vultures was that they had died of kidney failure. Something had destroyed their kidneys. But what? Finally, someone remembered reading that Diclofenac, which is a very common and cheap anti-inflammatory drug. Diclofenac is okay for mammals, warm-blooded animals, but it can be toxic to birds. And so they did an experiment with some captive vultures who had a broken wing or for some other reason could not be released back to the wild again. And they fed those captive vultures some meat that was treated with diclofenac. And those poor vultures got kidney failure and died. Diclofenac. But how were vultures getting prescription medicine? Well, it wasn't. You can buy it over the counter. It's very cheap. In fact, veterinarians were often using it. If an animal was injured or had a sprain or was sore, if an animal had a fever, they would easily give diclofenac to the farmers to treat the animals. It was cheap. But if the animal died anyway, then the animal's body was full of diclofenac. And when the vultures came to clean it up, because vultures eat dead stuff, when the vultures came to clean it up, they would collect enough of a dose of diclofenac to kill them. That was what was happening to the vultures in Nepal and North India. So last I heard, they have been urging veterinarians not to give diclofenac to farmers for sick animals. There are other medicines they can use, and they are trying to get the vultures' population back again so that sky burial and the open burial of dead farm animals will be safe again. So that's an example of a way that I use a fictional folktale to get people to pay attention to the fact that vultures are important, they do eat dead stuff, and then I can use that hook to carry it over to a scientific episode of something that was actually happening. We can use stories sometimes to insert some information that we want to share with our audience. For instance, many people are not quite sure why greenhouse gases are a problem. Carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane are a problem as their levels rise in the atmosphere because, well, they're called greenhouse gases because it's like the glass on a greenhouse. Sunlight comes in through the glass and is absorbed by the things inside the greenhouse and re-radiated as heat. In the open air, the heat radiates back out to space. But when there is a level of glass, the heat does not go back out. Light can come in, heat cannot get back out through the glass. It's like a blanket insulating the things inside the greenhouse. And CO2 and methane and some other gases act like that insulating blanket. But some people don't understand insulation. They don't understand how blankets work. A warm blanket, they think it makes you warm. A warm coat, a warm sweater, they think it makes you warm. No, it blocks. Blankets block. Blankets keep the heat from getting out. So I decided to put a little hook in a story I was telling. It's a lovely traditional story from Russia. Snegorochka, Snow Girl. The story says there was an older couple who had never had any children. But one day they went out and played in the snow with the children. And when the children were making snowmen, snow figures out of snow packed and rolled. Have you ever made a snowman? I don't know if it ever snows in Italy. It seldom snows in Oklahoma. But They made a snowman, and then they thought, maybe we could shape this a little more and make it look like the daughter we have never had. So they shaped the snow, and they gave her pale hair, and they carved her face, and they put gray pebbles for gray eyes. They put red berries for red lips. They shaped clothes just like a girl. Oh, they said, if only we had a daughter like this. It was getting dark. They went inside, and they were just having their supper when there came a knock on the door. And when they opened the door, there stood a little girl with pale, long hair, gray eyes, red lips. And she said, I am your daughter, Snegorochka. Please let me in. So they opened the door. Our daughter, she has come alive. They invited her in. Come, sit by the fire. No, thank you. I should sit far away. I need to stay cold. Oh, have some supper. Will you have some hot soup? She said, no, thank you. May I have a bowl full of snow? Here, have a cup of hot tea. No, thank you. May I have some ice water? And so they gave her all these cold things. And when it was bedtime, they made a bed for her far away from the fire, and they brought thick blankets. And I asked my audience, did she accept the blankets? And they often say, no, blankets are hot. I said, no, blankets block. Blankets stop the heat from going through. If you are a warm body and you put on a blanket or a coat, it keeps the heat in. It keeps you warm. It doesn't make you warm. In fact, if it's very hot outside and you want to protect yourself, a blanket will keep you cooler. The Tuareg people on the Sahara Desert, they wear heavy robes to keep the heat out. People who work in glass factories and iron mills, they wear heavy clothes, not to keep their body heat in, but to keep the extra heat out. Blankets block. So Snegorochka accepted the heavy blankets, and it kept the heat of the fire of the room from melting her. And she stayed, the story ends that she stayed many weeks with the older couple, but when spring came, she had to go. So I have snuck in scientific information about how insulation works, that blankets block. I have used a fictional story to convey some information, just as our ancestors often used stories to carry information. A friend of mine has written a story that I thought was very, very effective. Jenny Cargill Strong lives in Australia, and they have had problems with single-use thin plastic bags. Do you still use those in Italy? If you go to the market and buy some food to carry home, or go to the pharmacy, do they give it to you in a thin plastic bag? Some places have already blocked those. But it was a problem in Australia because the plastic would get into the ocean. So Jenny wrote this story. I have transformed it to move into an American watershed, and I'll tell you how Jenny's story goes. It is the story of Russell and Shelley. Russell just wanted to be useful. Russell, you see, was originally, see if I can show these to you, was plastic, pebbles, they're falling all over my keyboard. Little plastic pellets, they're called nurdles. This is the form that plastic comes when it is first made from petroleum. At the refinery, the plastic is formed into those little beads. And then those beads, those nurdles, they go by truck or by train to the factory where they are melted and made into so many things. Look around you and see all the things that are made of plastic. Russell just wanted to be useful. Russell thought, maybe I and my friends will be made into plastic measuring cups or measuring spoons for the kitchen. Perhaps we'll be made into the body of a chair for a classroom or to use outdoors. Maybe we'll be made into plastic toys or even plastic medical devices. We just want to be useful. But when that shipment of nurdles arrived at the factory and was melted and extruded and pressed thin through rollers and then cut and printed, they were very disappointed. They found they were made into grocery bags. This is from our grocery store called Homeland. And you can see why he was named Russell. Do you hear that rustling noise? Russell thought, well, at least I can be useful. I can carry groceries. And sure enough, a family came through the line and they put some apples and a jug of milk and some butter and other things in the bag and carried it out. In the States, that would be out to the car in the parking lot. And the car drove to the house and they carried the groceries into the house and they unloaded the groceries. And then, because they were smart people, they folded the bag and pressed out the air and saved it. And the next time they needed something waterproof to wrap up, maybe a bathing suit after swimming, or maybe to carry home somebody's shoes from soccer practice, they had something that they could use to carry them. And it was used. There's another voice on here. Hello. It was used several times, but then it got a hole in it and it was no longer good even for wrapping up the baby's dirty diapers or for picking up the waste from the dog. This is no good anymore, they said, and they just took it and threw it in the bin. The garbage was picked up, carried by a big truck to a place where the garbage was dumped. And Russell said, I just wanted to be useful. I was useful several times, and now I'm covered with coffee grounds and spaghetti sauce. And the wind blew Russell up into a tree. Have you seen plastic up in a tree? Then it rained, and Russell had enough, just a little hole, so the rain caught and carried Russell down to the ground, and the rain washed Russell around and down into a small creek and then to a larger river, and Russell went down the river looking up at the boats and around at the fish. And the river emptied finally into the Gulf of Mexico, and Russell floated in the seawater. And that's where he met Shelley. Shelley was a sea turtle, and she had just come ashore to lay her eggs. She dug a hole, laid the eggs, covered them up. At the next high tide, those eggs would hatch and come down into the sea. But now Shelley was tired and she was hungry. And she wanted a good snack, something to eat. So she went back to the sea and looked around, and she saw what she thought was the biggest jellyfish she had ever seen. It looked tender and tasty, so she grabbed it and she swallowed it down. After that, she didn't feel so hungry. Her stomach was full. And her stomach didn't empty because her stomach was full of plastic. And because there was no room for more food, Shelley became very weak. She began to worry, if I'm not strong enough to swim to the surface and get air, I will drown. I'd better go back to land. So she swam back to the beach where she had laid her eggs, and she climbed up on the shore. And it was a protected area. There were park rangers there to protect the turtle eggs from cats or dogs that might dig them up and eat them, or coyotes. And the park rangers saw, that's funny, a sea turtle has come back to the beach. They finished laying their eggs a week ago. That sea turtle looks pretty sick. It took 4 rangers to pick up Shelley and load her into the back of a truck. And they took her to the veterinarian. And the veterinarian x-rayed Shelley and saw the mass of plastic in her stomach. I'm going to have to operate, he said. And he cut open her plastron, the front shell of a turtle. He cut it open and took out Russell and some other scraps of plastic. Well, they sewed her back up again, and after 3 weeks of good food, she was safe and healed enough, healthy enough to put back in the sea. And so they returned her to the ocean. But Russell said, I just wanted to be useful. I didn't mean to harm that turtle. But luckily the rangers said, Doc, can we have that plastic that you took out of the sea turtle? The vet said, what do you want that for? He said, we need to make an exhibit to show people how dangerous plastic can be to wildlife. We have other things like those rings of plastic that hold different bottles and cans of beverages together. Those are very, very dangerous. They get around the neck of a bird or a fish and can't get off, and the animal can't grow. We have other plastic also. We want to use this, and we have photos. We'll tell the story of how you saved the life of the sea turtle by removing the plastic. And so Russell went into the exhibit. I have seen exhibits like that at our seashore national parks and other places too, of bird skeletons with plastic where their stomach was, showing how dangerous these are. And 2 days ago, when I told this story to an elementary school, they like animal stories, I talked with them about the right way, because most of our stores in Oklahoma still give plastic bags for groceries. And I said, the best thing to do is to take this plastic and put it in the recycle bin, because it can be melted down and made into more plastic things. But if you don't have a recycle bin, and my grocery store, Homeland, does have a bin to recycle plastic sacks, if you have to throw it away, be careful to do it properly. Squeeze out the air, tie it in knots. Yeah, come on. Tie it in knots so that it will not blow away, so that it will not fill with water and go down to the ocean. But even better, of course, is if you carry cloth bags that can be used over and over and over again. And I told the students, if your family has these cloth bags, you have a job to help your grown-ups remember to take the cloth bags into the store. That's the biggest problem with these cloth bags. They don't do any good if you leave them home. they don't do any good if you put them in the car and forget to take them to the store. So your job is to tell your grown-ups, remember the grocery bags. And the kids said that they would. And I showed them that although I use those grocery bags, cloth bags, I sometimes forget them. So in my purse, I carry nylon or cotton bags that don't take up much room. And that way, even if I've forgotten to bring my bags because I didn't expect to go shopping, I don't have to use the single-use plastic. So that's a story that Jenny Cargill Strong made up to use in Australia because they did have a problem. She told me, I'm welcome to share the story now. She doesn't tell it in Australia anymore because she said that most parts of Australia have now banned single-use plastic grocery bags. And I hope they are banned in Europe also. I know they weren't available when I was in Germany, but that was years ago. Now, that's an example of a fictional story that used true facts from the scientific situation, but brought those facts to life by introducing characters. Now, this is a children's story, and so they were talking animal stories, but of course, you know about Aesop, who made up stories with talking animals so that he could safely comment on political situations. The Aesop stories, many of them are like the editorial cartoons in newspapers. They comment about lying and bribery and people bullying other people to get what they want and so forth, or fooling themselves with fond wishes. But because they were talking animal stories, he didn't lose his head for telling those stories. So animal stories can be effective for adults as well as for children. But I think that Jenny's story is an excellent example of the way that you can research a situation, a problem like the danger of plastic for sea animals, and get your heap of facts and make that heap of facts into a usable story by finding a viewpoint character. And I'm going to tell you some of the science-based stories and history and fact-based stories that I have crafted by using that method of a character focus in order to make the facts come alive. One of the big issues in the environmental movement now is not just polar bears on melting ice floes or wolves being shot in Yellowstone or someplace like that, but eco-justice, issues of pollution that has affected humans. And I have a story for you about that comes actually from a friend of mine. This story is about Marika Horsting. Marika and I met when we were both in graduate school. We were roommates in an old house that had been converted to house women graduate students. Marika was studying biochemistry. She was especially interested in bones and how they are made stronger. I was studying botany and plant physiology. I wanted to study how do the plants control the shapes that they take and the functions that they use. We both got our PhDs and we went in separate ways, but we stayed in touch. In fact, Marika was a bridesmaid at my wedding, and I rejoiced when Marika married Samit Bhattacharya, a fine nuclear physicist at Argonne National Laboratories near Chicago. And Marika worked at Argonne also. There were projects there to study toxic chemicals like lead and arsenic and so forth. And Marika tells me that one day she read an article about cadmium being suspected of causing a very terrible and rare disease in Japan. The disease was called itai, and that means painful, and it must have been painful. It affected only older women living in the valley of the Jinzu River in Japan. That river flows down from the mountains and out into the Sea of Japan. I found out about this because Marika called me on the phone one day and she said, Fran, I'm going to Japan and I need your help. I know you have been there many times. Please tell me what I should expect and what I should do. I know manners are very important. Please help me. And so I talked with her about going to Japan, but I also was curious, why are you going to Japan? What brings you there? And that's when she told me the story of the Jinzu River Basin. She said she had been reading this paper about itai, and the paper said that the levels of cadmium were very high in the bodies of the women who had itai. But there was also an unusual amount of cadmium in the soil and in the water of the Jinzu River. And people always kind of thought the cadmium was the problem, but how come younger women and men did not get itai? Well, where did the cadmium come from? I asked, and she said, in the mountains where the river begins, there are mines. The Kamioka mine mines the ore for lead and zinc. There's a little copper and silver, and also a lot of cadmium because it's similar to zinc, so they're found together. But there was no market for cadmium. It was considered useless. If you're an artist, you may know about cadmium red and cadmium yellow. They're good pigments, but you want to wash your hands after you handle them. Cadmium was known to be bad for you. During the wars, the Kamioka Mining Company mined a lot of ore and purified it, and they could sell the lead and the zinc and the bits of silver and copper, but they could not sell the cadmium. So in the dead of night, illegally, they dumped the cadmium waste into the Jinzu River. The water washed the cadmium downstream. I'm sure it was accumulated in the river fish. Probably people who ate the fish got more cadmium than was good for them. But the special problem was farmers used the river water to irrigate their rice because they grew paddy rice. It had to be flooded during the growing season. And unfortunately, rice accumulates cadmium, not just in its leaves, mainly in its grain. And that means people who ate Jinzu River rice got more and more cadmium accumulating in their bodies. In fact, Marika told me she heard about a woman who had moved away from the Jinzu Basin, but she loved her village rice so much that her family kindly sent it to her. And she was one of the few cases of itai that developed outside the valley because she was eating Jinzu River rice. But they tried, these poor women with their bones breaking, even a touch would break a bone. If they tried to open a jar, they could break their fingers. Their skeletons would not hold them up. And it was so painful. And they tried to tell the government, get the money from the Kamioka mine. It's their fault because of the cadmium. But, Marika said, I read this research paper, and they did some research feeding cadmium to rats, and they found no effect on the bones. And I thought, oh, those poor women, they're not going to get any help from Kamioka or the government. And then she said, I thought, there's something wrong here. The research was done very carefully in the standard way, using young male rats. Do you see the problem? Young male rats, whereas Itai affected old women who had borne many babies. And as you may know, the mother's body sometimes mobilizes calcium from bones and teeth to meet the needs of the developing baby during pregnancy and nursing. Marika thought, those poor women, this work has got to be done again. And so she got funding to redo that work in her lab at Argonne National. She raised generations of mice, made sure those female mice had up to 6 batches of mouse pups. And she controls had no cadmium, and then a little cadmium, a little more. And sure enough, after having the cadmium all that time, those old female mice had bones that under the microscope looked like lace. She had proved in the lab that cadmium caused bone demineralization in older female mice. And her work was used by the lawyers to prove that the cadmium was the cause of Itai. And they already knew the cadmium came from Kamioka Mining Company, and the government and took money from Kamioka to give relief to those women who were living in such pain. They couldn't be cured, but at least they were cared for. A museum about Itai was built in the city in Tamoyama, I think is the city. And Marika was brought to Japan to give a seminar about her research. This is an example of how science can help to demonstrate the causes of eco-injustice. Science, when it's done right, can be done to help. And so Marika went to Japan and she gave a seminar, and she was thanked by the families of the women who had suffered with Itai. I'm very proud of my friend Marika Horstein Bhattacharya and the work that she did. Another problem that our changing world is going to face is how to feed so many people. Right now, in the Great Plains of America, industrial agriculture is raising enough wheat and corn, maize, you may call it, and soybeans to feed billions of people. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, in part raising so much wheat on great big farms. But these farms destroy the earth that they are growing on. They are like mining the earth. And I want to tell you the story of someone who is working hard to find another way to feed people without destroying the soil. And his name is Wes Jackson. Wes Jackson grew up on a small family farm outside of Topeka, Kansas, right smack in the center of the United States. When he was a little kid, he helped his mother in the garden, and they raised tomatoes and peppers and other things that they had to plant every year. But they also had fruit trees, walnut trees, grapevines, rhubarb, other things that grew year after year and produced food for the family. But the cash crop was wheat and corn and soybeans. And when Wes got old enough, he helped his big brother and his father to plow and plant those huge fields. I don't know about Italy, but in America, farm kids as young as 10 years old, if their legs are long enough to reach the pedals on the tractor, they help with the plowing and the planting and the harvesting on these big, expensive machines that plant huge fields of grain. He loved helping. He loved farming. But he was also fascinated with a few fields that were set aside for hay meadow to feed their cows and horses. The hay plants were left over from the days when the Great Plains of the United States were spread with grasslands for 1,000 miles. Grass that grew with perennial grasses that lived year after year and sent their roots down into the prairie 2 meters, 3 meters down. Annual grass like wheat only goes down maybe 10 centimeters. But the perennial grasses went way down. Even in dry years, the meadow stayed green because it could reach for water. And there were wildflowers and other perennial plants in the meadow. And he thought, nobody has to plow the meadow to make those things grow. They live year after year, and they give us good hay. What would it be like if our crops, our food crops, could grow year after year? Well, Wes knew that the Jackson family farm would go to his big brother. So he went to college. He studied biology. He got a master's in botany. He got a PhD in genetics. And he got a good job teaching at the University of California in Sacramento, where he started the environmental sciences department. He was very interested in these perennial grasslands that could grow year after year. And finally, in the 1970s, when there was another drought, we had them about every 20 years in the plains. There was, you may have heard of the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. In the 70s, there was another drought, and things were looking bad on the prairie. And Wes said, I'm tired of just teaching. I want to get back to the land. I want to get back to the farm. He came back to Kansas, to Salina, and he founded an organization called the Land Institute, trying to selectively breed native grasses so that they would produce grain. Our ancestors 10,000 years ago and more, they found wild grass that had a little grain, and they gathered it, and the largest ones they saved and replanted, and the largest of those they saved and replanted. They developed wheat from a wild grass called triticale. In Mexico, they developed teosinte into maize, the Indian corn that you may know, by selectively gathering and reproducing the plants. And Wes said, I bet we could do that with some of our perennial grasses. And then they would keep their roots in the ground for year after year. We wouldn't have to plow. We wouldn't have to see the wind and the rain take away our topsoil. It's being lost at the rate of 1 inch per year in some places, 2.5 centimeters a year of loss of soil. It takes 10,000 years to build 1 inch of topsoil, and we're losing it. It's being mined by industrial agriculture. So Wes started the Land Institute and began selectively breeding. He got graduate students and new PhDs to come, and I forgot to bring with me, I'm not at home now, I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, but I forgot to bring a sample of my kernza. Kernza is the name they have given to the grain they have bred from a perennial wheatgrass that grows on the prairies with its roots 3 meters down. Kernza can live and give harvest for at least 3 years, and it is delicious. It tastes like, brown rice or whole wheat. It makes wonderful hotcakes. So they have developed, just in the space from 1979 until now, they have already bred the kernels of grain till it's about the size of a grain of rice. That's not big enough. They're working on selecting it more. Meanwhile, what about the rest of the world? Not everybody lives on wheat. In Africa, they are working on growing perennial sorghum, which is an important crop there. In China, they are working with Chinese scientists to breed perennial rice. And I just learned from a Land Institute bulletin that scientists in Hunan province in China have bred Chinese rice with a dryland rice from Africa, and they have produced rice plants that have lived for 4 years, producing 2 harvests per year without having to plow and plant again. And their harvests are about the same level as the annual paddy rice. Imagine how much less work it will take, much less fuel, much less digging and loss of the soil. So I am very proud of the work that Wes Jackson has done to help feed the world in a way that won't destroy the land we depend on. That's a story that follows the life of one person, just as my story about Marika Horsting-Bhattacharya followed her work on Itai. You can research these subjects and produce a truckload of facts, but unless you have an interesting storyline and an interesting character, it's hard for people to pay attention to it. I will tell you one more story, and this is a story I put together after visiting the place where it happened. And I am going to use as my viewpoint character, I'm going to use a bird, just our kind of bird, just because this story takes place over 200 years, and one person wasn't there the whole time. I call the story Birds and Beavers. Long, long ago, in the valley of the San Pedro River, the river ran down from Mexico, ran north into the state of Arizona, a desert state. But in the valley of the San Pedro, there was green because of beavers. There were so many beavers living on the San Pedro, one beaver dam every mile, every 2 kilometers or so. There was a beaver dam that would block the flow of the river so that during the heavy summer rains, the water did not scour out the river and escape. It stored up the water so that it could soak into the ground and be available during the dry season. The wetlands around the river grew up lush in grass and marshes and water birds, amphibians, insects. The trees grew tall, and migrating birds going from South America and Mexico into North America, they could rest and get food and water in the trees along the San Pedro. But there was another kind of bird that did not migrate, and that was the western willow flycatcher. Little brown birds that eat flies, but they only make their nests not in the trees, not in the grass, only in bushes that grow up where young willow trees have been cut down by the beavers. The beavers they eat the bark, they use the branch in building their dam, and where they cut it, it grows up in many shoots, making bushes, willow brush. That was the only place that the western willow flycatchers liked to build their nests. So they depended on the beavers, and they were very happy for we don't know how many thousand years until the trappers came. In the 1820s, trappers came as far as Arizona hunting for beavers. You see, in those days, a gentleman was not a gentleman without a tall felt hat, and the best felt was made of the fur from beavers. In Europe, the European beavers had been almost wiped out. in order to make felt hats for gentlemen. The beavers in Scandinavia were gone. Trappers came to North America, Canada, the East Coast. They trapped the beavers and sent the fur back to making hats. And finally, when they got to Arizona, I never knew beavers lived in Arizona. When they came to the San Pedro, they called it the Beaver River because there was a beaver dam every so often. And so they got busy and they trapped all the beavers. And when the beavers were gone, they left and looked for more. Well, without the beavers, there was no one to cut down the young willows, and soon the willow had all grown up tall. There was no brush for the western willow flycatchers, and they flew up into the hills to the banks of creeks to find some kind of brush to make their nests. Meanwhile, without the beavers to maintain their dams, the heavy rains of summer came and washed away the old dams and cut deeper and deeper into the bed of the San Pedro River. The deeper it went, the more the water level in the surrounding banks fell down until they were in the river. Farmers came. Ranchers came and they tried to feed their cattle on the grasses that were growing there. Hello?
Hi.
Okay, my clock says I still have a couple of minutes. What do you want to finish?
I think that time is running short. Some students are going, so if it's fine for you, we are leaving the time for some questions from the audience here in
I'll just summarize. And
yes.
Every time the western willow flycatchers came back, they found the river was no good. And it wasn't until people caught wild beavers and put them back in the river. Now the San Pedro River is in very good condition. And the western willow flycatchers can live there again. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
So thank you, Fran, for interrupting you. So now students here should, not all I say, must have at least one question since we have to interrupt it. So,
I can see Gaia having a question. Hello, Gaia. Do you have a question? I see your hand. Have you raised up your hand? Gaia.
I've got a question then. In the meantime, this year in Europe, the UN 2030 agenda suggested that an holistic approach should be used to face and deal with sustainability. So my question would be, what role do you think that storytelling could have in this holistic approach?
Well, I'm not sure how you define holistic, but I would say that stories can be effective first by making people aware of the situation. At some level, aware of the different plants and animals that we live with, and just know that they are out there too. It's not just us. Also, stories can make people aware of social justice issues in the environment, pollution of water, pollution of the air, trash such as the plastics that are going out into the world and being a problem. So stories can teach about the fact that those things are out there, but furthermore, stories are not just facts. Stories make us care about the situation. And if we care, then we might be inspired to do something. And I like to tell stories like Marika Horsting and the cadmium pollution, or about Wes Jackson and figuring out a different way to grow food, as models of things that people can do. Stories, you could tell stories about the original tree huggers in India who literally put their lives on the line to prevent trees from being cut. You could tell stories about Extinction Rebellion, where people actually throw themselves on the railway tracks to stop fossil fuel trucks. I know a woman who's been arrested 12 times and plans to do it some more. You can tell about people, even small things like community gardens and recycling projects. You can tell those stories and inspire people, as in the story about Russell and Shelley, where I tried to get children to help their parents remember to use those reusable bags. So, does that answer the question? Ways to share stories. And again, I say, aware, care, dare.
Can you hear me now, Fran? We have a question on the chat. Chiara Gagliano. How can we overcome the catastrophic apocalyptic climate storytelling spread, especially in the press media discourse?
Okay, maybe I'll look at that in the chat because I can't understand your words. It's echoey. Apocalyptic climate storytelling. Okay. The apocalyptic side is so scary that it often prevents people from taking any action. They just shut down. What we need to inspire action is hope and models of things that we can do. Greta Thunberg said, when someone asked us, but where do we find hope? She said, start to take action and you will find hope everywhere. Because you will look around and you will find other people who are taking action, and that will give you hope. I tell my stories a lot of the time. I'm only invited to tell specifically eco stories to people who already agree with me, like the Sierra Club and Nature Conservancy. I'm preaching to the choir, as we say in America, like the preacher talking to the people who are singing in church. They already have the message. But at least the story affirms what they're doing, makes them know that other people have the same feeling, and gives them courage to continue. But I also tell stories to people who would not voluntarily come to hear eco stories. I live in an oil company town, fossil fuel country. I live in cattle country. They don't want to hear about methane. But when I tell stories, I sometimes slip in one of these hero stories, or I slip in what I call stealth eco-telling. For instance, an old man was sitting on his front porch taking a nap. A stranger walked up. "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me how long will it take for me to walk to the next town?" And the old man opened one eye and looked at him and closed his eye. "Sir, it won't be hard to tell me how long will it take to get to the next town?" And he opened the other eye and looked at him, closed his eye. "Well," said the stranger, and he turned and he started walking. And the old man opened both eyes and watched him for a few seconds and then said, 10 minutes. And the stranger, very angry, came back and said, "Well, that wasn't hard. Why didn't you tell me when I asked in the first place?" And the old man said, "I had to see how fast you were walking." Well, I think this week you have heard about many projects to try to take action, but how fast are we walking? Are we doing something about it? And a story, a little story like that, or you probably know the medieval tale about the mice who wanted to protect themselves from a cat by tying a bell around its neck. They considered many other things that they thought wouldn't work, but a bell, yes, we would hear the cat coming. Great idea, but who's going to do it? That's the kind of problem we're up against. Great idea, public transportation. In my town, there isn't any. Where are we going to get it? Who's going to do it? Those stories sneak in an idea that can start discussion. I hope that answer helps. Other questions?
Are there any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Thank you. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Fran?
Yes.
Okay. There's another question. Okay, so you can read some comments on the chat if you want. Thank you all. From your method is great. My wife and I have been working in education for more than 30 years. So how can we change educational systems from grade-based to competency acquiring? The university should be leading instead they're getting to be the handicap. That's not really.
That's a question for you and not for Fran.
That's right. That's right. I am not within. You must burrow from within. I am not on the faculty, and I can't make a change from outside.
Okay, I think that our time has run out. Or is there some other questions? Time for another question, perhaps?
A very quick one. A quick question. No. Okay.
No.
So I think time to.
Okay, perhaps people would like to know where. Please, heavy echo. If you would like to know where to find stories, my website is franstallings.com, and go to the EarthTeller pages, and there are 40 or 50 sets of stories with science that people are welcome to use. Also, if they go to Sierra Club or to, let me find my other, well, anyway, I have references for all of these stories, and I have other stuff. Maybe I can send this to you, and it can be distributed in case anybody is interested.
Much for just, I think, very stimulating activity.